Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the continuation of week 3 of the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference. Tonight's session is entitled Remembering Rachel, Confronting the Legacy of Illegal Slavery in the Midwest. We have some community standards during our conference. I'll verbalize a few of them here, and Kaden is going to link the full version of them in the chat. Please obtain consent before taking any photos, screenshots, or copying text, and generally sharing content that is not your own. If you're taking notes for class or just for personal use, that's completely fine. We just don't want to be sharing content that is not our own. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. When you are speaking, please turn your camera on and identify yourself. Speak clearly and slowly so that our live closed captioning service is as accurate as possible. We are utilizing live closed captioning for all of our MCIC sessions. To view them now, you can look at your Zoom taskbar and click the CC button on your screen. This might be located under the More button as well. And you'll want to click View Live Transcript. Please message us in the Zoom chat if you're having any difficulties. The QR code on your screen links directly to the Campus Climate YouTube page. This is where we are housing all of the sessions that are recorded during the MCIC conference. Many sessions are being recorded to make them as accessible as possible for those who cannot attend live. The recording links are also posted in the Whova app or in the web browser version. And like I said, they are also available on our Campus Climate YouTube page. If you have questions at any point during tonight's session, you can message us both publicly and privately. I have a list of your hosts and co-hosts available to you here tonight. We also monitor our Campus Climate email account, so you can feel free to message us there during tonight's session or at any point throughout the conference. And finally, I would like to introduce tonight's session entitled Remembering Rachel, Confronting the Legacy of Illegal Slavery in the Midwest. This is being presented tonight by Eugene Tesdahl. This session aims to introduce all participants to the legacy of illegal chattel slavery in the Midwest, including Platteville, Wisconsin. Participants will view a filmed visit to Rachel's grave, an African-American woman whom John Rountree, founder of Platteville, Wisconsin, enslaved illegally here circa 1830 to 1842. This filmed excursion and following virtual presentation will force participants to confront the legacy of slavery and bigotry in their own community. I will now turn things over to Jean.
Thanks so much, Emily. And I want to offer thanks and praise to Emily and Kaden and the entire Campus Climate Department, and also all the support that made this conference possible for the last 3 years. So it's an honor to be part of it. I will get started, and I'm glad all of you are here. And I will share my screen to get that going. All right, so Emily already told you the name of this session, so I don't have to say it again. I will turn to this slide, which is kind of more of the same. In the chat, if you would right now, can you please answer, when I say slavery or chattel slavery, what comes to mind? So please respond to that in the chat. When I say slavery or chattel slavery, what comes to your mind? So please keep typing if you are, but I will read some of these as they're coming in. Brittany said, I think of my ancestors. Caden said, exploitation. Natasha said, American system of slavery, which considered Black people to be property that could be bought and sold. Brett said, large plantations in the South pre-Civil War. I said, inhuman, and I'll add to that, inhumane. Amanda said, abuse, harsh conditions, long hours, hard work, without a voice. Brooke said, I think of evil. Emily said, the labor that America was built on. And you can still chime into that if you haven't had a moment yet, but I would say all of those are valid things to say and that come to mind when we say slavery and chattel slavery in America. If you would still use the chat for just a little bit longer, what difference does it say if I do what I did in my title, if I say slavery in the Midwest or illegal slavery in the Midwest? Does that change what you would say? All right, and again, if you're chiming in, please still do that, but I'll read some of these. So Caden said, it reminds me that slavery was once legal in the United States. True. Brittany said, slavery still happened in the North. Also true. Not really, Amanda said, not really, slavery should have always been illegal. Totally agree. Brooke said, I feel like because slavery was so normalized back then, it almost seems like an oxymoron, but slavery was illegal in the North. And not always, in some parts of the North that sometimes it wasn't illegal, but it will be for what we're talking about tonight. And Brett added, we don't often hear about Northern slavery, and that's true. So some of you might have heard some of my research before, or research that some of my students here at UW-Platteville have done about illegal slavery in the Midwest. And if you haven't, that's why we're here tonight. Whoops, push the wrong button. Okay, here we go. So how I'm going to organize my talk is I'm going to have us remember Rachel. We'll learn who Rachel was, why we should remember her and her life, honor her as an individual. We're then going to kind of unpack the legacy of illegal chattel slavery in the Midwest, not just in Wisconsin, but in Illinois and Iowa. And then I hope to leave you with some food for thought. Some of you might be zooming in tonight from much farther away than just across campus at the main campus of UW-Platteville, and others of you might be viewing this later from further afield. And so I hope to end the session with some suggestions of how you might interpret or encounter difficult subjects where you are. So, and then we'll end with a Q&A and some dialogue at the end. Whoops. So first off, interestingly, a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight happens in the Driftless region of Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois, and involves African-American people. It also involves Ho-Chunk people and Potawatomi people and Sac and Fox or Mishkwake and Saukee people. And so first, I think it's really important to have a sense of gratitude that this story of settler colonialism and the ugly brutality of chattel slavery in America is also rooted in the dispossession of the Driftless region that among with other nations has long been Ho-Chunk or Ho-Chungara land. And a couple words here I want to start with Washopeeni Seep, which is Ho-Chunk for an African-American person. Many translate this as Black Spirit or Black Frenchman, or in fact, the term Washopeeni often is kind of has to do with someone who talks a lot, and the notion from the Ho-Chunk perspective that French people talked a lot or perhaps bent or changed what they said. But notice it's interesting that still in the 21st century, that's the Ho-Chunk word for an African-American person. Also, Mukade-Wias is the Anishinaabe-Moan term for African-American people. So Anishinaabe-Moan is Ojibwa language, but it's also very similar to Potawatomi. And this literally translates as black meat. Some translate it as black flesh, which then you might think sounds like black-skinned person. But when you add the term wias to like Wawashkeshi wias, that means deer meat. So it's still the term. So this is an interesting and kind of a debated term for African-American people in Anishinaabe languages. But I want to show here that the link between Native American history and African-American history, especially in the 18th century and the 19th century, is often a really connected story, and it is in what we're talking about tonight. So when we start to talk about remembering Rachel, I'll even start, I guess I'll start with this group of students. In this image, we have Caitlin Niehaus, Brandon Snyder, Kelly Crown, Keegan Miles, Joe Adante, and Dylan Abernathy. And these were all UW-Platteville students enrolled in my Black History in Wisconsin course in the summer of 2019. And at the beginning of that course, I knew we were going to do some of this research about Rachel, this woman whom John Rountree enslaved illegally in Platteville, Wisconsin in the 1830s and into the 1840s. But I didn't know right over here that actually we were also going to repair her 1854 headstone. So I don't know about you, many of you might be college students, or you might have a college degree or 2 or 3. But when I was studying history, I never thought I was going to ever be repairing an 1854 limestone grave marker. So I had no idea to do that. And so community organizers helped these students and me learn how to do that and do it well. I'll talk about that more in a moment, but now I would like to show you this film that my original goal here was that during this conference, we would, if it had been in person, we would all actually walk. We would go behind Culver's in Platteville, Wisconsin, and we would go to Rachel's grave. But since we were virtual, I hope that this film made by UW-Platteville filmmaker Russ Hill might make us feel, at least for a few minutes, that we're not in front of our screens. So with that, I will stop this share and start another one. Okay, here we go.
Eugene, could you turn the volume up a little bit?
Sure. Greetings. I am Dr. Eugene Tesdahl of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. We are in the middle of the Driftless Region of southwestern Wisconsin. We're in the Mississippi River Valley, and we're on a hill in Platteville, Wisconsin, home to Hillside Cemetery. And I'm standing here next to Rachel's gravestone. This dates to about 1854. And Rachel was a really remarkable woman who was enslaved illegally in Platteville by the founder of Platteville, Wisconsin, John Rountree. He enslaved her here from about 1828 to about 1842. And then she lived with and worked for her former enslavers from 1842 till her death in about 1854. And this is a very simple grave marker. And students and I restored this gravestone in 2019 with the help of community partners. And that's part of why it's here today. I hope you are enjoying all the topics covered in the MCIC. And even if you are sitting in front of a computer screen today, hopefully this session makes you feel like you've come to Hillside Cemetery as we discuss the important life of Rachel. All right, so I will bring us back here. And you could unmute, whoops, here we go. You could unmute a second if you wanted, if we can discuss this just a little bit. What difference did the 4-minute video make? Or what could you learn about Rachel's headstone when you looked at it in the Rountree family burial plot?
You get to see kind of just how small it was and is.
Good point. Let me just interject there that her headstone is 10.5 inches tall by about 7 inches wide. Okay, so it is not big. Any other comments about the video? I'm going to give us one picture to look at. Sorry. Go ahead.
Brittany asked in the chat if the headstone only had an R on it.
Yeah, great question, Brittany. I'm trying to find a different picture, but this is a good one. So yes, Rachel's headstone only has a capital letter R and a period on it.
So I think that makes it feel more inhumane. Like her name wasn't even recognized, not when she was born, not when she had passed, just R. It just feels very disrespectful.
Excellent point, Brittany. And some people disagree about that. Most historians and most Black folks I know don't disagree on that. We believe that this absolutely, as you said, this really shows not much respect for her at all. It's true that some people who were especially born enslaved might not have known their birth date, right? But you probably knew their name. So you could have put the whole name, first name, and maybe a last name on there. And you could have put a death date on there. So you're absolutely right. Great point. Anybody else watching the video?
It kind of, just the R itself again, kind of makes it feel like this family who we knew wasn't poor was cheaping out on this gravestone. Like it was so small and only had one letter on it. Like they didn't want to pay for the entire engraving.
And again, that's an excellent point. And all sorts of poor folks actually, that was typical, right? Actually, so sometimes people, regardless of ethnicity in the 19th century, sometimes they would have a pretty Spartan grave marker because it was cheaper, right? But to your point, right, the Rountrees had plenty of money, and I'm trying to find a better picture. Pardon me. I usually have it. Hold on. Well, let's see. Geez, here I thought I was all prepared. It's in the one picture here, but you can't quite see it. Do you remember seeing in the video, and I'll unpack all this in a moment. But in the video, do you remember? Sorry, I went through all that. But in the video, did you notice the very tall obelisk in the middle? So that obelisk is 10 and a half feet tall, and that is John Rountree's headstone. And it's an obelisk, it's over 10 feet tall, and it's made out of marble. So the one thing I want to finish before I move on here is there are still people in Platteville and in Wisconsin who say that the Rountree family honored Rachel by burying her in their family burial plot. As many of you have just covered, I urge you to consider if you agree with that, if you think that a 10-inch grave marker made out of limestone shows the same respect as a 10-foot grave marker out of marble, and one letter is the same as someone's first and last name, their birth and death date, and some other points about their life. I urge you to suggest that it doesn't show much respect to Rachel at all.
We do have a couple questions in the chat. So we have Brooke. Brooke said, why was she buried in the Rountree family plot?
And I'll get to that in just a minute.
Okay. And then we have
one.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's a great question.
And then we have, were they trying to keep her a secret because it was illegal?
And that one's quick. No, they weren't. And remember, by the time she was buried there, she had been free. She was a free woman for 12 years. But she lived with and worked for the people who had enslaved her. So do consider, how awkward that would have been, and at times likely dangerous for Rachel. But I will answer. Are there any more questions, Brittany?
No, just a comment.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you.
Okay, I should answer that next question moving on here. So here's an image of other students who just a couple years before actually helped uncover the significance of Rachel's life, and also the fact that John Rountree and also Governor Henry Dodge, the first territorial governor of Wisconsin, that he too had enslaved people illegally in Wisconsin. These students are Liz Larison, Winnie Redfern, Simone Rand, and Tori Kusabucky. And here again is just a brief look at this. We had students, it's basically a special kind of epoxy that is designed to fix stone that was used. And then we used a chemical solution that eats lichen. Lichen is this little moss that can grow on stone. But when we first saw Rachel Stone, if you look down here at the base, it had been completely snapped off and it was laying on the ground. And that happened somewhere around 2015. We do not think it was vandalism. We think it was probably bumped by a lawnmower, and that happens to old stones often. But if we had not repaired her stone, and you could not, the lichen was so dark you could not read the R. If we had not repaired her stone, this letter R is one of the only things that reminds us that Rachel existed. So it really would have been a terrible loss to history. So in the fall of 2019, right before the world went sideways in COVID, I and some community partners had a rededication for Rachel's gravestone, and Reverend Gus Barnes was really key to that. So were a lot of members of the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs here at Platteville, including Jeremy Payne, and then Cam, who is a student here, Cam Gray Dillard. Anyway, that ceremony was pretty interesting because, again, while we know a bit about Rachel now, there's a whole bunch we don't know about Rachel. Can you remind me one more time of that question that I was supposed to get to, Brittany?
Yeah. So it said, why was she buried in the Rountree family plot?
So some parts of the Rountree family and some other members of this community, as well as some historians, although very few of those, say that the Rountrees buried her in their family burial plot to honor her. Also, so she was enslaved by the Rountrees from about 1828 or 1830 to about 1842. And then she continued to live with and work for them from 1842 till her death in about 1854. So about 12 years. And so it was actually sometimes common for even free laborers, regardless of ethnicity, if you died while working for a family and you lived with that family, and if you had no next of kin or didn't tell them of a next of kin, it sometimes was the case that you would get buried. So that was not necessarily exclusive here. What is interesting is even with European American hired men or domestic servants, staff, they often got their whole name on a stone. So it definitely seems different the way that Rachel was buried and how her stone was made. All right, so now I want to get into just a little bit more of the history. Some of you already figured this out. Chattel slavery, the enslavement of Africans and people of African descent. Many of you might be well aware of the 1619 Project from the New York Times. That is a really valuable resource. And so in a big way, chattel slavery arrived in North America in 1619, but it actually had already been brought by the Spanish to New Spain, Mexico, by 1519, 100 years before that. And also chattel slavery sometimes included the enslavement of Native American people, including in Wisconsin in the 1720s, the French and Ojibwa were enslaving the Reynard or Meskwaki people, the Fox Nation. But here's some background. For those of you who aren't remotely, some of my stuff got moved around here. This dot is Pleasant Ridge here. So here's a little context. I'm talking to you from Platteville, Wisconsin. Potosi, Wisconsin's over here. Dubuque, Iowa's over here. Galena, Illinois is over here. Lancaster, Wisconsin. Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. Pleasant Ridge was a free Black community founded by African-American farmers, especially of the Green and Shepherd families and the Grimes families in 1850. So before Wisconsin statehood. And this is Cheyenne Valley, which is up near Viroqua, Wisconsin, or Richland Center, Wisconsin. And that is a free African-American farming community that thrived from the 1860s into the 19-teens. And so this just some of the places I'll be talking about. I thought this map adds a little context. So there it is. And this is the Mississippi River. If again, you are farther afield. So part of this story happens to do with the Northwest Ordinance. So as the United States Constitution was being agreed upon in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance is what was trying to claim what would become the American Midwest. So from Ohio to Minnesota, including Wisconsin. And Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance said, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory," end quote. So beginning in the very year the Constitution was written, it said that chattel slavery was illegal in this area. Now, as some of you have already said, that doesn't mean that enslavers didn't drag enslaved people into this area against their will. They did, and that's part of Rachel's story. Also, I'm jumping ahead then. So despite treaty boundaries, especially between the federal US government and the Sac and Fox or Meskwaki and Sauk nations, and with the Ho-Chunk Nation in 1825, a lead boom or lead rush started to engulf this area, and that is denoted here in gray, which you can see is a lot of that same area I'm talking about. So there were some African-American people who were enslaved in other parts of Wisconsin, but about 100 African-American people were enslaved in the Driftless region during the lead rush from about 1825 to about 1842. And this included Rachel. Just a little bit before that, we had this very interesting historical figure, Jim Beckworth. He got his freedom in 1822 and near St. Louis, Missouri, and he jumped on a flatboat and signed on to work for a lead mining expedition at Fever River, which is what Galena, Illinois was originally called. And this quote I think is really interesting from Jim Beckworth. He said, quote, "I remained in Fever River for the space of 18 months, occupying my leisure time by working in the mines. During this time, I accumulated $700 in cash, and feeling myself quite a wealthy personage, I determined upon a return home," end quote. So some of you might know that lead mining is not easy at all. So my colleague, Dr. Christy Clark Pujara at UW-Madison, she often says that maybe Jim Beckworth was being facetious or sarcastic, kind of saying, hey, in my leisure time, I mined for lead. So there were also at the same time, notice, so Jim Beckworth was a free African-American person, and he arrived just about 8 years before Rachel and others would be brought illegally into Wisconsin and Illinois. This quote, at about the same time, some of you might have heard of David Walker's appeal in 1829. It was a really controversial document. It was a pamphlet that blamed almost everyone for chattel slavery. David Walker was a free Black clothing store owner in Boston. So he blamed white enslavers for slavery. He blamed free Blacks for slavery. He blamed free Blacks and enslaved Blacks. He blamed pretenders, white pretenders to Christianity. And he also noted with this quote, this really centers on lead mines in Georgia and, gold mines in Georgia and lead mines in the Driftless, where he says, quote, "The whites are dragging us around in chains and in handcuffs to their new states and territories to work their mines and farms to enrich them and their children," end quote. So notice what was happening here was actually gaining national attention. It wasn't just something significant in the Driftless. So these images here are of Henry Dodge, George W. Jones, and John H. Rountree. Notice when I first pulled up the slide, I just have enslavers under their names. What difference does it make if we just put enslavers there?
You're not really recognizing like the bad stuff that they did. It makes me think of like if you put a picture of a mugshot and you just put like criminal rather than putting like the name of the person, you need to actually acknowledge your name so you know like the bad stuff that they did. Otherwise, you're almost like not like you're treating them not with like the atrocity that they committed.
Okay, so that's a good point. That was Brooke, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Brooke raised a good point. So maybe that strips away, takes them off the hook for the crimes they committed. Anybody else?
I think Brooke made a really good point. I was kind of thinking, honestly, more on the opposite end, that I felt like enslavers was kind of an activating word, whereas usually it's like slave owners, or, you know, like some of this past language we've had is very passive, and doesn't actually, hold them accountable usually when we talk about it.
Yeah, that's a good point too. But both of these are really valid points. And I'll, where I'm building tonight, we'll touch on both of those points. So we shouldn't let people off the hook for the crimes of the past. But yeah, some people call people like Henry Dodge, George Jones, John Rountree, call them slave holders or slave masters, right? And those are, again, really passive words that I think also take them off the hook. So when I talk about this story, I talk about how Rachel had been enslaved, but she became a free Black woman. And then these people, I am not trying to necessarily honor them when I call them enslavers for what they did. So here, this is a document that I'm one of the few people who have read this lately. It is a deed of sale for $330, 20th of May, 1830. And it was with this piece of paper that John Rountree, founder of Platteville, Wisconsin, purchased Maria and Felix in Galena, Illinois. And so do any of you see what's wrong with that story? John Rountree purchased Maria and Felix for $330 on May 20th of 1830 in Galena, Illinois.
They are treating them like property.
Exactly, Brittany. So this is a deed of sale, not a bill of sale. So this is right on either side of this page are transactions for land, for houses and land. So exactly, Brittany. Anyone else?
Kaden put in the chat, just quote, bill of sale in regards to humans makes my stomach churn.
Yeah, it's terrible. When I got physically angry and sad when I touched this document. Here it is transcribed because it's a little harder to read over here. But quote, a Negro girl, a mulatto, aged 19 years, named Maria, no father, with her son, Ward, a boy aged 18 months and named Felix, end quote. So also notice there's all sorts of offensive language here, part of why I used quotes for it. But James Stevenson was the recorder of deeds for the county of Joe Davies at Galena at this time. So he was the person in charge of keeping that book, and he sold Maria and Felix to John Rountree at that time, and Rountree took them to Platteville about a week later in 1830. So also notice here, slavery had been illegal in Galena since 1787, also illegal in Galena since 1811 when Illinois became a free state. And Rountree took them to Platteville, which was in free Michigan territory at that time. And by 1836, Platteville would become part of free Wisconsin territory. But this is galling. This made me very angry, and maybe it makes some of you angry or disappointed. I'd say those are very legitimate emotions. Here is a document. It's a manumission, which is a document with which people are freed. So Henry Dodge, the first territorial governor of Wisconsin, he brought Tom, Jim, Joe, Lear, and Toby to Wisconsin illegally from Missouri in 1827. And he promised them that after 5 years of working for him in a free territory at the town that bears his name, Dodgeville, that he would free them. What does this manumission tell you about his promise? So he said in 1827, I've been enslaving you here in Missouri, but we're going to go to this place, Dodgeville, and I'll free you after 5 years.
He did free them, but it was over 10 years later.
Yeah, almost 12 years. And notice here, Dodge became very wealthy from lead mining and prominent, which is why he got elected first territorial governor of the free territory of Wisconsin. The other real galling thing here, when he freed them in 1838, he had already been territorial governor of the free territory of Wisconsin for 18 months. So he'd been elected the governor of a free territory of the United States and had been enslaving 5 people for 18 months before he finally decided that it was bad for his image to enslave people in a free territory. So that's really hard information to digest. Yeah, go ahead, somebody.
So freeing them wasn't even for upholding his end of the promise. It was more of just his image.
Yeah, that was a significant part of that choice. And when he did free them, he had them each sign a 50-year indenture so that if they went very far from Dodgeville, then he could basically still force them to come back almost as if they were still enslaved. Here briefly is part, by the way, this document, the manumission of Tom, Jim, Joe, Lear, and Toby, with each one has their own unique X. They were illiterate, but they had their own mark. So this says their name, and then it says his mark, his mark, his mark, her mark for Lear. She was a woman. This document is in the Southwest Wisconsin room in the basement floor of Alsvik Hall on our campus, in our campus archives. So are a lot of these records. These are census records. So here we have John Rountree. Notice, so this is the federal census. The federal census, wrap your minds around this, from 1790 to 1860, for 70 years, the federal census had these categories at the top: free white persons, free colored persons, slaves. And then over here, it even has things like wheelbarrows, dishes. So notice, and slaves here is on this second page. That really goes to that dehumanizing fact of enslavement. So this is the federal census of 1840 for free Michigan territory. Here's John Rountree. Here's the people and his family members. And then there was one free African-American boy between the ages of 10 and 24. This might have been an individual called Warren Christopher, but I'm not quite sure. And then over here, there's a male enslaved between the age of 10 and 24. This number one is Felix. This number one, a woman enslaved between the age of 54 and 100. This is Rachel. And then also it shows us that by 1840, 10 years after Rountree purchased Felix and Maria, Felix's mother is gone. And we don't know, did she die? Did Rountree sell her away from her son? Did she run away? We don't know. And to my knowledge, we just don't know that yet. But notice here, Rachel only gets a number one here. That kind of signals that she exists. Next, here is the federal census of 1850. Here's John Rountree's entry. So notice Rountree freed Felix and Rachel between 1840 and 1842. And on this though, remember, Rachel, she's listed, this F is for female, this B is for Black. Her age is listed as 65, which is helpful information. So that tells us that she was born in about 1785. But we have her name. She didn't sign this, right? But it tells us her name in print. She's a free woman by this time, but she's still living with John Rountree, the man who enslaved her. And it also tells us here that she was born in Missouri, which is a useful bit of information. Also here, we don't have any picture of Rachel. We do have a picture of America Jenkins, who was a woman who had been enslaved in Potosi, Wisconsin in the 1820s. And by the 1850s, she had gotten her freedom. She migrated to Lancaster, Wisconsin, and then even became a matriarch in that free Black community of Pleasant Ridge by the 1860s. And this, I think, stirring photograph of America Jenkins is in the Grant County Historical Society in Lancaster. So I have a little bit more on this last portion, which will be quick, but are there any questions before I move on to that?
I have a question.
Please.
So I guess this is my first time hearing this. I'm still kind of new to Platteville. I've been here 2 years, but 1 year through the pandemic. And I work on campus. And I understand that there's a residence hall named Rountree. And I'm wondering if there's any talk of changing that, or if there's a process. to change that. I think that it's very uncomfortable to know that we even have a residence hall. I mean, I'm assuming it's named after this man.
Yeah, Brittany, it is named after John Rountree. I'm not proud that it's named after John Rountree. It reminds me of Rachel and Felix and Maria every time I see his name in print. The last portion of my lecture here, I'm going to kind of get into that. I can briefly answer your question, Brittany, to tell you actually the Chancellor, Dennis Shields, had a study done in the summer of 2020, I believe, about every single person for whom a building is named on and near our campus, and to see if any of those people in 2020 were more controversial than when they were named, the buildings were named for them. And the only one that, the reason that study was done was because of exactly what you said, Brittany, that people had already been saying this was offensive. And our campus is not alone in having buildings named for people who did terrible things. To me, it is striking that Rountree Hall was built and named for John Rountree in 2012, not in 1912, 2012. The fact that John Rountree had been an enslaver in a free territory in a free state, that information, it wasn't maybe well known, but it was there. And so that to me also makes that a really frustrating name on a building. Great point.
Yeah, thank you.
So we will have more time for questions at the end here. You've all been very patient. I may well already be over time, but the last bit here is pretty quick. And my point here is, if you are especially, Brittany lives here in Platteville, and she's already thinking about how some of this difficult information might impact her and how she might, I think, have an ability to push back against it. And I also want this last short portion to maybe inspire some of you. If you live in a different corner of the Midwest, or a different corner of the United States, or even a different corner of the globe, there are probably difficult topics near you. Maybe they'll be easy to find. Maybe people are already debating them, but maybe they're not. And if they're not easy to find, you might wonder, are they being hidden? Are those topics being hidden purposely, or are they just happen to not be known, right? So I hope that this last portion will inspire us all to wonder and question what we can maybe do going forward from tonight. So I talked to you about some of what my students and community partners have done here. In Montgomery, Alabama, there is this monument, this marker called the Dexter Avenue marker. It was put up in 1944. And this marker says that that spot is where Jefferson Davis had his inaugural parade when he became president of the Confederate States of America. What do you notice about that monument being put up in 1944 in front of the state capital of Alabama in 1944? What do you notice about that monument?
Why would they feel the need to idealize that even in 1944?
Or maybe especially in 1944. So a monument in Montgomery, Alabama, where the president of the Confederacy was sworn in and had a parade in 1861. Maybe that's not shocking. That it was put up in the middle of the 20th century might be surprising, right? Many people have wanted that torn down for many, many years. Some activists finally decided in 2015 to put up this monument right across from it. So these monuments face each other now. And this is called the Montgomery Selma March Monument. So this civil rights memorial now stares directly at the Jefferson Davis Memorial. So you can think about, would you have done that the same if you were in that situation? But the community of Montgomery decided to do it this way, which basically kind of shoves civil rights in Jefferson Davis's face in a way. Also, Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is a historically Black university. In 2018, the president of that university, Dr. Sidney McPhee, said, quote, "Despite the fact that the name of Forest Hall will remain, our efforts to ensure that MTSU remains an inclusive place where all students and staff feel safe and welcome will continue unabated," end quote. Forest Hall is named for Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, which he founded in 1865. Notice this is then all sorts of complicated that there's a hall named for him on a historically Black campus, right? I haven't followed this up since 2018. My guess is it's still named Forest Hall, but I'll show you in a moment, some things are changing. Whoops. Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Some of you might be more familiar with this. So beginning in 1890, statues, huge statues of Confederate generals were put up in this former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. The first one was Robert E. Lee in 1890. The next one, or the next two, were Jefferson Davis and Jeb Stuart in 1907, followed by Stonewall Jackson in 1915. These especially, notice that most of these were built around the turn of the 20th century at a time when volatile white supremacy was really peaking. That would even get stronger in about 1916. And so the Black community had protested these from the start. Other people started to protest these, especially in the 1940s. Calls to remove all these statues were decades old. In 1996, a compromise was reached to put the famous world tennis champion Arthur Ashe, who's an African-American who is from Richmond, Virginia. Arthur Ashe's statue was added to this in the middle of these Confederate generals and the president of the Confederacy. Added to this in 2019, the internationally renowned artist Kehinde Wiley was commissioned to build a bronze sculpture called Rumors of War, and it was installed at the Museum of Fine Arts Richmond in December of 2019 at the head of all those other sculptures. And notice this is a young Black man on a horse, but he's in a hoodie and he's got braids and he's looking back over his shoulder at all those Confederate generals and also Arthur Ashe. In June 2020, George Floyd's image, Frederick Douglass's image, and Black Lives Matter messages were projected onto, especially this is Robert E. Lee's statue, and calls to remove these statues of Confederate leaders increased exponentially and were amplified in the summer of 2020. The governor of Virginia said, quote, "It was wrong then and it's wrong now, so we're taking them down," end quote. But notice the Black Lives Matter movement, as it resurfaced in 2020, came really over a century of protest against some of these statues. Many people never wanted those statues there. And then the Jackson and Stewart statues came down first, and then ultimately the mayor of Richmond owned some of the property that those statues were on. So then some of those came down later. Before I conclude and we discuss a little more, there's this quote. Somebody said earlier, you know, we shouldn't just let people off the hook. Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, said in 2017, quote, "I am a firm believer in keep your history before you. So I don't actually want to rename things that were named for slave owners. I want us to have to look at those names and realize what they did and be able to tell our kids what they did and for them to have a sense of their own history. When you start wiping out your history, sanitizing your history to make you feel better, it is a bad thing," end quote. And again, you don't have to agree with Secretary Rice's statement, but I think it's an interesting one to contemplate in everything that we've been looking at tonight. So in closing here, I hope you learned a little bit more about Rachel. I hope you don't forget her. If you live in Platteville, I urge you when it's not raining to go over behind the Culvers and up the hill. You can see a big sign that says Hillside Cemetery, and that's where you can find Rachel's gravestone, and maybe you can honor her and remember her there. And in whatever you do, I urge you to amplify Black history and amplify Black voices. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gene. Does anybody have any questions? I know that was a lot to digest, so it's okay if we need to take a hot sec and think about it.
I have a comment. And sorry, I have a lot to say, just being an African-American woman. So I think that thank you for sharing the story of Rachel. Like I said before, it was something I had never heard about. And I definitely will take the time out of my day to go visit her. I also wanted to say that, you know, when whoever they is that named Rountree Hall what it is, I think that it was a big slap in the face to all the African-American students who were going to Platteville at that time. I think it was a very passive-aggressive way to say you don't belong here. That's just my interpretation of that. But I was just thinking of that when you said that was named Rountree in 2012, because that is just very recent, and that's just not okay. And it gives me an icky feeling, just, you know, even working with my students now in the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs. So, wow, this was a very, deep topic. And thank you so much for restoring her grave and taking the students with you. And shout out to your students for going and appreciating Black history. So
thanks, Brittany. And also I should say, Black Student Union here at Platteville has been supportive of this research and this work. I should also say that in 2012, there were exponent articles, particularly from members of the Black Student Union, who said in 2012, why are you naming this Rountree Hall? And it happened anyway. But I think a couple of years ago, fall of 19, some of the students who did this research about Rachel started to even think about, it was never actually brought up in Student Senate, but at least discussed, I guess it was discussed on record in Student Senate about the possible name change there. But I think you're absolutely right, Brittany. This is still, it should give us all an icky feeling. It should also make us consider wherever we are, we should think really hard if we name a structure after anyone or anything, we should consider why we're naming it after that person, and we should know about that person before we name something after them.
I don't really have a question, but just kind of a continuation of this and a comment. It just reminds me so much of the sentiments of, well, what if we have to change that mascot's name, or what if a monument is taken down, then we won't know the history, or how will I know what sport I'm cheering for anymore? Like what Brittany shared and what others have talked about throughout this as well is like words and dedication, and these things have impact and they really matter. We will know Robert E. Lee's history whether we have to see his large face in a park somewhere or not. We know about John Rountree and we don't need to proudly name a building after him. I mean, we could go on and on. And so I personally would push back on that narrative. And I think perhaps what I'm thinking that Condoleezza Rice and so many others maybe are in support of is keeping those names or keeping those monuments or teams and things like that, because words hold significance and really have an impact, and we have so much access to information. Trust me, we are not going to forget who these folks are, and we don't need to hold them. There's so many other folks that could be held up or celebrated.
Great points. And again, let me be clear that in sharing some of those opinions, I'm not endorsing those opinions. But it is still a debate. A lot of this is still debated, and that is my point. And I think it should be debated in places like Platteville. And to your point, Emily and Brittany, that's part of what I've aimed to do with some of the articles I've written about Rachel and Maria and Felix and others, that rather than celebrating enslavers, let's not forget the people who were also Wisconsinites at an early period when some people, even members of the Black community in Wisconsin, don't always know, because many of us, even in Wisconsin history textbooks, aren't even reminded that African Americans have been in Wisconsin since the 1760s or 1730s, when the French were bringing African Americans here as well. I think you're right. We can remember people like Rachel, and that is at least a step in the right direction.
I think to like piggyback off you, Emily, like Robert E. Lee and all those statued people are the people being talked about in the textbooks and in the literature, where people like Rachel are not. So it's just like, yes, I agree. Like, we don't need that constant reminder that, they were, people on this planet when they're already being talked about in the text. So that's a little frustrating.
I think it's a lot frustrating, Brittany.
Okay, I promise I'm done.
It's value added.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you definitely don't have to be, Brittany. Yeah, I just wanted to say to Eugene that I appreciated your intentionality of language used during this session, specifically around enslavers and enslaved. I think I can't speak for everybody's like K through 12 experience, right? But I feel like a lot of folks, a lot of white folks in particular, were taught, like we were taught about slavery, and folks were referred to as slaves, like they weren't given a name, they weren't given like human dignity. And so I think that's a really important reframe in language, that this was something that was done to them. They were humans, they were people, and not, like they themselves are not slaves. I think that's a really important like historical reframe that I think we all need to work on. I need to work on personally too.
Yeah, thank you. And just briefly, all sorts of historians like Tia Miles, Christy Clark Pujara, others have been laying that groundwork for over a decade, so that was done intentionally. So slave is an object, a slave, that's an object. an enslaved person, that's a person, right? And a slave holder, to hold, that seems like a benign act, but those were enslavers. So yeah, I'm not the only historian who's trying to make us change that language, so thank you. Right. And Emily just said indentured servants, which is another big topic that I cover in classes. So indentured servants, sometimes African Americans or people of African descent were indentured servants, not as often as Europeans. And indentured servitude was not kind and gentle. Sometimes indentured servants also were worked to death or beaten or branded, but it was not lifelong. Although you did see it when slavery was ended in places like Wisconsin and Illinois. So slavery was ended in 1842 in Wisconsin, 6 years before statehood, but then they would have people sign, often under duress, these indentures of 40 years, 60 years, 100 years. So basically it was trying to use that to extend the unjust conditions of slavery.
I just had one last thought that like popped in my head, but Rountree made no effort to conceal what he was doing. Like you had talked about illegal slavery, dude literally put it in a census. And again, not that that behavior should ever be hidden, but I think some of the arguments I've heard from locals in the area, are justifying his behavior or saying it happened in the past, or well, we don't know about all that, but it's super well documented and he made no effort to hide what he was doing.
And I won't go into all the detail there, but Christy Clark-Bujara and I and others have explored that, and we agree with you. People like Rountree and Dodge and George Jones, they knew what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew they weren't going to get caught. They knew that nobody was really going to work to, by the 1830s anyway, they knew that nobody was going to do that because they didn't do it to people who were breaking the law in Ohio in 1790. So they just reported it on the census, maybe even partially to boast about it almost. Yeah, and it's disgusting and it's disappointing. Yeah. I've also heard people say, John Rountree was a man of his times, which that doesn't work for me. Well, it seems like most of you are leaving. So if you have to leave, thanks again. It's been my honor to be part of the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference.